Hello everyone, my name is Mr. Gentleman and we are here to do one thing and one thing only, discuss Dragon Quest II, the hit sequel to Dragon Quest. Note that this review is based off of the original NES version, though all remakes will be discussed. The incredible success of the first Dragon Quest game was undeniable, with it selling over 1.5 million copies. Yuji Horii reached celebrity status, and the phrase role-playing game became synonymous with Dragon Quest. Enix was more than happy to approve Horii and Nakamura's desire to immediately go to work on a sequel. Yuji Horii returned as head designer and writer. Koichi Nakamura was once again the director, and his development company Chunsoft was commissioned once again to program the game. Akira Toriyama was again on board as the artist, and Koichi Sugiyama was back as the composer. Previously, we discussed how Yuji Horii engaged in both streamlining and simplifying RPGs to be enjoyed by the masses. To recap, streamlining is taking complex activities and making them easier to perform. Simplification is taking deep mechanics and making them shallow. Horii now wanted to improve Dragon Quest streamlining and simultaneously undo much of the simplification that made Dragon Quest more shallow than PC RPGs. The most important change was being able to control a party of characters and fight groups of enemies. The development time of the game, however, was extremely short. In an interview, Nakamura recalls being incredibly busy every day, constantly receiving instructions from Horii, and not having time to do debugging until close to the due date for the final version. Horii himself was so busy that he never played through the entire game before the release. In fact, nobody on the development team did. While they consider the first half of the game to be fine, both co-creators consider the second half to be unbalanced and thin on content. Dragon Quest II would debut on January 26, 1987, less than a year after the release of the first game. As for the localization, rather than Nintendo publishing the game, Enix brought the game to the West themselves. Once again, it would have to be called Dragon Warrior rather than Dragon Quest due to copyrights. The Western version would be released in late 1990. Dragon Quest II's gameplay received an overhaul compared to the first game. The combat system is probably where the changes are the most profound. It has similarities but is simultaneously different from its predecessor. Random encounters will now take you to a separate battle screen rather than just a small window. Completing console RPG's transition from homaging wizardry to having a full battle screen. As mentioned before, battles were no longer one-on-one, but you had a party which would face large groups of enemies. The completely black backgrounds are somewhat disappointing compared to the first game's colorful backgrounds, but I suppose it has to do with the lack of the NES's power since it has to process so much more now. Combat, like in Dragon Quest, is menu-based. You could attack and use items as usual. The party system is this game's biggest improvement. While the party system is basic to our modern eyes, remember Yuji Horii was introducing these concepts to a wide audience little by little. The party would consist of 3 members, all descendants from the hero from Dragon Quest I, and thus descendants of the ancient hero Erdrick as well. The Prince of Kanak and the Princess of Moonbrook could use spells, but since the hero didn't have any, he instead had the run command. Running being the hero's prerogative would become a staple of future titles. The hero is solely a physical attacker with high attack and high defense, and can equip most of the weapons and armor in the game, but has no magic whatsoever. You will be dependent on him for the entire game, as he will almost always be your biggest damage dealer. His 2 drawbacks are that he's limited to attacking enemies one at a time, and his equipment can be quite costly. The Prince of Kanak is the balanced character, able to do decent physical damage and learn some pretty good spells. Early on, he learns Fireball, which harms a single enemy, and Heal. During the late game, he'll learn Heal More, Fire's Bane, which is the first attack he'll gain, which can attack every enemy and every group of enemies, and much later he'll learn Defeat, which instantly kills all foes, but only works on certain enemies. Stop Spell, which stops an enemy from using magic, returns. New to the game is Increase, which buffs everyone's defense, bringing stat buffing into the game's strategy. In terms of armor and weapons, he can equip a decent variety. The Princess of Moonbrook is exclusively a magic-based character. She learns very strong offensive spells and is the first character to be able to attack multiple enemies in a single group, which no one else can do in your party for about half the game. She almost immediately learns Heal More and Infernos, which does major damage to all enemies within a single group. As the game goes on, she'll learn Explodeth, which attacks every enemy and every group for massive damage. She is the only character in the game to learn Heal, which restores all of a person's HP, and Defense, which lowers all of the enemy's defense stat. In terms of weapons and armor, there isn't much variety for her at all. As expected, her physical and defensive capabilities are subpar. While giving an explanation of some of the attacks seems redundant, I reiterate that this game was released in 1987. The detailing I just gave should make clear what a leap this is from the first game and how much of the simplification has been undone, offering much more variety and strategic possibilities. Learning to properly stack damage between all attacks and single-hitting attacks, or staggering damage properly by having the princess handle large groups while the two princes handle tougher enemies, is all part of the game. I should note that while Dragon Quest II did not have an elemental system that would be introduced in Final Fantasy, it did have a very basic system, in where magic would work better against certain enemies, be neutral against others, could have a chance to fail against certain types, and there were scenarios where it wasn't effective at all. Before I move on, I should explain why I've been referring to these characters by titles and not by names. Similar to Dragon Quest I, the name you give the hero will affect your game. In this case, it changes the names of your companions. An in-game algorithm will determine whether the Prince of Kanak will be called Bran, Glyn, Talint, Numor, Lars, Orfeo, Artho, or Esgar, and whether the Princess of Moonbrook will be called Varia, Alani, Olisa, Raz, Kaelin, Pita, Elith, or Gwen. Unlike Dragon Quest I, however, this has no effect on your base stats or stat growth. Moving on, something that I have alluded to that also became a mainstay of early Dragon Quest titles was that enemies would operate in groups. Monsters are divided up into the groups they are part of, as stated in the lower right-hand box. When you went to attack, you wouldn't select individual enemies, but groups. The AI would then choose who in the group to attack for you. Another thing that I alluded to before was that certain attacks like Infernos hit every enemy in one group, while Fire Bane and Explodeth hit every enemy in every group. In terms of how intelligent the AI was, it was decent at choosing which enemies to attack, but it did sometimes make less than wise decisions. Let's say the Prince of Kanak hits an enemy. Next up is the hero. Now, because the hero's attack is significantly more powerful, the AI may offer him to attack another enemy he can kill in one hit. Most of the time, that works out, because rather than one dead enemy, you have one enemy dead and one severely weakened. However, sometimes you'll be in a situation where you'll want to get rid of an enemy more quickly and not leave him alive to see another turn. In that case, the AI may not act in your favor. I believe the reason that Yuji Horii implemented the group system is related to another flaw in the combat system, one that veterans of Final Fantasy are all too aware of. Basically, as long as you attack enemies in a group, even if one member is defeated, anyone else who targeted that group will continue to attack the others. However, what happens when two people target a group, but one kills the last enemy within that group? Well, the attack would essentially miss. Most of the time, you'll never notice this, but I wonder if the grouped enemies system was a way of masking the issue. Granted, the group system does have its merits. It means that you have to strategize around it in order to beat enemies more quickly, deciding how to stagger your attacks between which enemies. The fact that it does add to the gameplay and to the overall personality of the game means the grouping system isn't completely unwelcome. Honestly, I'm not totally against the idea of grouped enemies. It would be interesting if a game used enemy groupings, or even just the concept of only being able to hit certain enemies at a time for strategic purposes. Yuji Horii would actually play a major role in a game that did the latter.
That comes later!
Another Dragon Quest staple introduced are weapons having special abilities if used as an item. For example, if you had the Staff of Thunder equipped and used attack, it would do mediocre damage. However, if you went into the item menu and used it, it would unleash an attack equivalent to using the Inferno spell without wasting any MP. As for the difficulty, the game absolutely falls under NES Hard, and is widely regarded among Dragon Quest fans as the most difficult title in the main series. It's very easy for things to go very wrong very quickly. The battles and complex dungeons can be grueling and even unforgiving at times. I'm actually fine with that. What is frustrating, however, is the lack of balancing later on. There are huge difficulty spikes, very few dungeons to go through to level up to smooth out said spikes, so that when you do finally reach the game's most difficult dungeons, they become extremely rough to get through. At the same time, there are always good strategic solutions for every situation. Some grinding will be necessary whenever there is a difficulty spike, and I assure you, this game has difficulty spikes, not curves. However, they don't end up devouring the entire game like Dragon Quest I. But even though there is a lot less grinding, it feels more intrusive than the first game. That may be because the first game had you out adventuring so much that you got used to it, while in this game there is a much more even flow in terms of progression, so that when you do have to grind, it feels like everything has suddenly come to a screeching halt. There is, though, one major grinding session that comes from the pit of hell itself. When you pass the Cave Throne, the second to last dungeon of the game, it won't be long until you begin to run into monsters that do obscene amounts of damage. Eventually, you'll come to a shrine that has two things: a warp back to a previous city, and a priest who completely heals all of your party and saves your game. The message the game is trying to send you is clear: it's time to grind, and grind a lot. This is the longest and most difficult grinding session possibly for the entire series. The enemies often do absurd damage, and the entire thing becomes tedious very quickly, and I personally had to break up the grinding sessions because it became too boring. Enemies also have one-hit KO spells, the worst being the Gold Baboon's Sacrifice, which causes it to kill itself but take down all of your party members with it. Moving on to character building systems, there really weren't any outside of purchasing and finding equipment. However, what worked in Dragon Quest I remains in this game. This is where Dragon Quest's trademark economy comes in. Shops sell varying level of weapons and armor for varying prices. It's up to you, the player, to engage in whether you want immediate gratification or larger savings. The former means that you buy the slightly stronger weapon and or armor now. The latter means you'll save your money and can buy a much stronger weapon and armor later. Risk and reward becomes part of the process, because you must continue to trek through tougher areas, possibly doing less damage now than you could, so that you could get better weapons and do more damage earlier in the long run. How you shape your roles, as to be expected of a role-playing adventure, is entirely up to you, and you alone bear the consequences. If you have played Dragon Quest I or have watched a previous video, you'll know that all interaction was done through a menu you have to access by pressing A. The menu was meant to streamline the commands you had to type out in PC RPGs. Dragon Quest II streamlines the streamlining. The interaction menu still has to be used to talk to people and use items, but the commands to search the ground and open treasure chests has been condensed into one command. The stairs command has been omitted, since you can simply walk over them now to use them. New to the menu is the ability to equip equipment manually rather than the game doing it for you. It's not the most comfortable system, but at least it's there. What is strange, however, is that the equip menu only covers your weapon, shield, armor, and helmet. There are actually many accessories that can only be equipped from the item screen. Going back to items, each character has their own separate item inventory. I like this idea in theory since it adds a sense of realism. However, a major issue as to how this franchise handles it is that even when you equip your equipment, the item remains in your inventory. When you realize that each character can only hold 8 items, and combine that with all of the important items you have to hold, such as keys, you'll find that you'll have little room for anything else. Yuji Horii was concerned that many players would not have played the first game, so he had you start with just a hero like in the first game, and then you would gain your party members as you progress through the story. Now you may be thinking, isn't that par the course for RPGs? In the 1980s it was not. Many PC RPGs allowed you to create your characters from the very beginning. Horii, sensitive to a public new to RPGs, wanted to ease them into more complex concepts. This makes Dragon Quest II one of the first RPGs where you gained all of your party members over time as part of the story. The exploration and dungeon design are some of the finest points of the game. The exploration contains the prototype that every RPG would mimic, as well as build upon to this very day. The first Dragon Quest game had a very freeform structure. Dragon Quest II's first half, however, starts like how many RPGs would. The land would be shaped vertically or horizontally in nature, as if directing you towards the only possible goal. You could deviate from the beaten path, and every now and then you'd have to discover something out of the way before you could proceed, but there was still a single goal. The early game didn't completely abandon Dragon Quest I's excellent ideas, however. The camera is still minimalistic in what it shows you in terms of your surroundings. You still have to go off and find and discover things for yourself in order to better your progress. The land isn't too narrow, encouraging you to make sure you search thoroughly, and you end up going through forests and mountains, making it a fulfilling journey. It's still even possible to miss some places, as I can admit that during my first playthrough I completely missed the first city. And you still have to be clever, as there are a few areas that require some thinking outside of the box to reach. The game was open enough to allow freedom, and there are a few areas you could find before you were supposed to, but the land was shaped enough to be guided towards your next objective. The second half, however, completely changes this. This is because of the ship. It was the first vehicle in a council-style RPG, and it was probably the most meaningful form of transportation in a video game at the time. Transportation in other games at the time simply allowed faster movement. The ship, however, allowed for exploration to expand from a few pieces of land to a large map. It's at this point that the game's design philosophy shifts back to Dragon Quest I, but rather than being a non-linear adventure on a relatively small continent, Dragon Quest II was a much bigger, non-linear journey out at sea. In the last episode, I mentioned that because you had to venture out into the unknown in a seamless, open world, you felt more like an adventurer and it felt more immersive. You felt less like an 8-bit sprite and more like you were actually on a journey. Dragon Quest II attempts to translate this into a seafaring adventure with mixed results. On one hand, the world is open, made up of various continents and islands with no hand-holding at all. You must rely on clues and even journeying blind to find different locations. Each location has clues about other areas and how to find various items important to your quest, making it an investigative adventure full of mysteries you have to solve like the first game. What's nice is that it doesn't matter what location you start at first, because it'll give you clues about other places, and that place will give you clues about even more places, and eventually you should make it to every place you need to visit. And on top of that, each location is somewhat interesting, as each city does show some personality. The dual dynamic of the game's first half being fairly linear and the second half being non-linear was a prototype for all future console RPGs, and it deserves mention just for that. With all that said, the concept has some flawed execution. Sailing is slow, and because the map is so big, trekking across it can be tedious. It takes a very long time to get anywhere, making it easy to become bored. There is also a major lack of dungeons during this portion of the game. The only dungeons available for a long time are the Lighthouse and the Tower of the Moon. While finding cities are fun, there are a few places where you can do combat and search for treasure, dragging out the sailing. The random counter rate while at sea is low, so combat doesn't make it any more interesting either. Considering that sailing, find city, talk to people, and then sail more is all you'll be doing for a while, it can become very monotonous very fast. And also consider that you can end up finding a location, find you really can't do anything of value there yet, forcing you to leave, sail elsewhere, and then sail back later. Sailing can easily wear thin on a less patient player, and sometimes you'll be looking for an island you know is there, but you end up missing it, forcing you to aimlessly sail in circles for a long period of time. Even though this is one flaw, it's one gigantic flaw and it hurts the game's enjoyment tremendously, especially since it takes up so much of the game. In Dragon Quest I, getting lost could be fun, but in this game, it can very quickly end up a frustrating mess. Dragon Quest II's dungeon design philosophy has two major dungeon types. The first two dungeons are of the first type, where every floor is a long corridor with multiple branching rooms, which have been blackened out of vision. This forces the player to go out of their way to see if there's anything of interest or a staircase to the next floor. Since dungeons have high encounter rates, this design increases the risk of running into enemies. The third dungeon introduces the second major type, the tower. Towers would become a franchise staple, with their holes that drop you a floor down, and being able to fall off ledges to land you outside. Their design philosophy is similar to the first game by having large one-room floors that act as a maze of staircases, with certain ones leading to dead ends, forcing you to backtrack and try another staircase. However, this game is far more devious in execution than its predecessor. In the first tower, you'll climb 3 or 4 floors to find nothing. That's because the real staircase is hidden all the way back here. Towers are also never straightforward, as you'll find that the treasure you came to find won't be on the top floor. You'll have to climb a few flights, and the way to progress will actually have you find the next staircase that goes downstairs to an area on the previous floor you couldn't access previously. As the game goes on, dungeons begin to blur the line with these ideas. The Lighthouse and Tower of the Moon have areas obscured from view. Before, you could get an idea of what was far away by looking from a distance. Now, you had to go up and see what was there. Combine that with the maze of staircases concept, and you can see why people consider this game to be so difficult. The sea cave begins to get crazy, with absurd amount of staircases and branching paths on top of HP scraping lava being everywhere. Personally, I enjoy the dungeons at this level of depth and complexity. Most of them are a great challenge. You'll often find yourself taking the wrong path multiple times, causing you to exhaust your MP, forcing you to make a temporary retreat. Many consider this frustrating. While perhaps they aren't always respectful of the player's time, they're still very enjoyable to the hardcore gamer. My patience, however, wears thin when it comes to the Cave Throne. You start with a large floor design with staircases and a new obstacle, collapsing floors. Then there's this long hallway with branching rooms that repeat themselves, and only one has a staircase. Then we reach the longest godforsaken corridor in the game, which would be simple if it weren't for the fact that you're not just looking for the exit here, you also have to find the game's best equipment. Oh, by the way, after you find the best sword of the game, you have to practically start the dungeon all over again. At some point, we reach a huge floor with about 20 floor traps, and in the final section, we get a long corridor where picking the wrong branching room sends you back to the beginning of the area. And did I mention this dungeon has absurdly difficult encounters? If a lack of balance is to be found anywhere in the game, the Cave Throne is where it is. This was a time where death in games meant something. You don't get a revive spell until late in the game, and you can only hold one revival item at a time. The House of Healing, where you can undo a curse and detoxicate from poisoning, is really the only consistent means of reviving a character for most of the game. A neat little touch is how the cost of staying at inns increases as you gain more party members. I am always really appreciative of attention to detail. Lastly, I want to talk about the saving system, which introduces a series staple. In the first title, your only save point was the King of Eilifgard. However, Dragon Quest II is a larger world, with the first half marked by dungeons that separate entire areas of the overworld. However, Hori wanted to maintain the difficulty level the first game's saving system offered, so instead, almost every town in the game has someone you can save with, much of the time that person being a king. But, just like Dragon Quest I, there are no game overs. Instead, you are given a vicious scolding by the person you had last saved with, and you lose half of your money. The result is a kind of tension when you're out in the field, forcing you to weigh your risks carefully. The story of Dragon Quest II takes place 100 years after the first game. The hero of the first game and Princess Gwaelin's descendants have established 3 kingdoms throughout the lands east of Eilifgard. The castle of Moonbrook has been assaulted, and a surviving knight has made his way to Midenhall to warn the king. After hearing that the wizard Hargon has begun his invasion of the kingdoms of the world, he tells his son, the prince, who is the hero of this game, that now is time for him to rise to the occasion. After giving him a sword and a bit of money, you and your silent protagonist are off to save the world. Throughout the game, you will find your cousins, fellow descendants of the first game's hero and of Erdrick, who will help you defeat this great evil. The game's story is similar to the first, but now with more details. You have a primary evil, you must figure out how to reach the villain who lives in a place that seems unreachable, and this leads to an item hunt. Said items being attained through gathering clues and information and traveling to find new places and gather more clues and information, eventually leading to finding what you need. And on top of that, you must hunt down the ancient tools of Erdrick. Overall, a simple story, but a huge leap for 1987. With all that said, there are a number of details I wish to talk about. Note that we will be dealing with spoilers. In the town of Hamlin, someone tells you that all is not as it seems. There is a strange dog in the town, and if you talk to it, for some reason, it begins to follow you. When you get the Mirror of Ra, you're meant to use it on the dog. Suddenly, she transforms into the Princess of Moonbrook. Personally, I found the dog following you and the way the quest played out to be noteworthy. Much for the sake of being thorough, I have to give mention to Dragon Quest's style of storytelling. Much like with Dragon Quest I, as it will be with the rest of the series, the game is not dependent on cutscenes, though the opening added to the American localization is quite effective for its time. The game is mostly dependent on player agency and interaction, with the player being an active investigator, talking to townspeople, gaining clues, and the player having to put those clues together to decide where to go next. Rumors and legends are passed on to you by townspeople, and you must look into them yourself. There are a number of ways to properly use and improperly use a silent protagonist, and Dragon Quest has been an example of the proper way as well, with the main character being silent so that you could fill in his thought process as how to deal with all the information he receives. The events, like the first game, are still quite simple, and the overall plotting is thin, but future titles would build on this foundation. As mentioned before, you're not only the descendant of Erdrick, but also of the hero of the first game. There is something special about playing the descendant of someone you used to play in the previous game. It's one thing to have a story where the hero of legend is someone mentioned in exposition. It feels special to know the game references a legend that you played out previously. Another nice touch are descendants of other descendants. The person you need to show the token of Erdrick in the first game, he is a descendant that you need to show the token to in this game. But the most notable one comes when you see Sharlock Castle, the final dungeon from the first game. Inside is the descendant of the Dragon Lord, someone who hasn't done anything wrong, not yet anyway, who says the world truly belongs to him, and that in order to defeat Hargon, you must find the 5 crests, which begins your adventure to search the whole world. One neat little touch is the way the game uses art to create surprise. At this point, you're used to the greenery, the mountains, and even deserts. When you complete the second to last dungeon though, you're suddenly greeted by white snow, which left an impression on me. It seemed desolate, and conveyed to me that I've entered into the most difficult part of the game. The snow sort of reminded me of the eternal winter from Narnia, which serves similar purposes symbolically. Dragon Quest II's endgame is very ambitious for its time. After finding the 5 crests and making your way to Hargon's castle, it looks a lot like the hero's home, Castle Midenhall. However, if you follow the hints properly, which inform you that Hargon is a master of deception, you can use the charm of Rubis to undo the illusion, which reveals the castle's true nature, as well as the monsters confirming that the illusion was meant to be a kind of false paradise, where you wouldn't want to have to fight anymore. You face the wizard in what is actually a pretty easy fight, which is because he's not the final boss. Upon death, Hargon summons the god of destruction Malroth. Not much is known about him, other than that he, well, wants destruction. From what we can assume, due to the fact that all monsters disappear after Malroth dies, and people acknowledge that his death has brought peace, it seems that he has always been the true evil, and Hargon was probably the head of the cult that wished to summon him to begin with. This would mark the first time that we would have a surprise final boss, rarely mentioned anywhere else in the game, and the first time a surprise power behind what you thought the final power was the actual final battle, something that would become a thing of contention in discussions of future RPGs. However, it should be noted that the remakes deal with this problem and mention Hargon's desire to summon Malroth from the very beginning. Upon the end of the game, one of my favorite parts of the first game returns. You have to make your way back to Castle Middenhall yourself. Enemy encounters are no more, and whenever you talk to people, they are celebrating the death of Malroth. To quickly talk about the music, Sugiyama's sweeping score lends a certain power to the game. The map themes are impressive in their ability to help build the fantasy world you're traveling in. The battle theme felt fitting for how tough the battles could get, and the song played in towers were always a chilling reminder as to how harsh they were. The beauty of certain songs, such as the castle theme, are a real wonder considering the limitations of the hardware. Visually, the game looks smoother than the first Dragon Quest. I know my perception may be colored by the updated visuals of the localization, but the improvements in monster designs are really excellent in my opinion. The slimes seem to have this nice shine. The little details such as the hair on the baboons and other small things such as that really stand out to me. While the original game was for the Famicom and NES, there are a few ports and remakes. The first port is the MSX version, which is considered to be mediocre due to choppy scrolling, bad titles, and overall just poor visuals. The Western localization, Dragon Warrior 2, features upgraded visuals, a save battery rather than the original game's password system, and as mentioned earlier, a new introductory cutscene. Like with the first game, people speak in Old English. There is also some censorship, such as rather than coffins with crosses to represent dead party members, they are now represented by a kind of ghost. The first true remake is a Super Famicom version made along with Dragon Quest I. This iteration uses Dragon Quest V's engine, giving it a nice visual upgrade, as well as sound that's closer to Sugiyama's orchestra. It's also very nice to have backgrounds while in combat as well. The overall gameplay feels smoother and less clunky. The L button acts as an all-purpose action command button. The AI for targeting people in groups is also more intelligent. Also, if you kill off a group and someone was still targeting it, their attack will automatically be carried over to the next group. You can now break pots and dresses like in later Dragon Quest games, and you can often find stat boosting items. Most notably, however, is that enemies give more experience and drop more money, making the game less grindy. The next remake is the Gameboy Color version, again placed in the same card as the first Dragon Quest game. New visuals have been added for the introduction. Gameplay-wise, it's mostly the same as the Super Famicom version. The physical power of some of the Princess of Moonbrook's weapons have been raised. Interestingly, the game uses the original Japanese names for characters and for locations. The biggest change is obviously in the visuals, which have been tweaked to something the Game Boy could handle. Later, Square Enix released the Dragon Quest collection for the Nintendo Wii, which contains both the Famicom and Super Famicom versions of the game, as well as having some of the game's events included in the animated introductory cutscene. Lastly, the most recent remakes are the ones for mobile phones, Android, and iOS. Dragon Quest II, regardless of how rushed the development was and how Hori and Nakamura felt, was released to much critical acclaim, and behind that was consumer acclaim as well. Perhaps the Japanese public simply wanted more Dragon Quest after experiencing the original. The game ended up outselling the original Dragon Quest, selling 2.4 million copies. The Super Famicom and Game Boy Color remakes together sold 1.92 million worldwide, and the mobile version has been downloaded over 1 million times. What can be said about Dragon Quest II? There should be no doubt in terms of how much we owe to this game, and I don't believe it gets enough credit these days. It took what was in Dragon Quest I and advanced it in every way. While Dragon Quest I was indeed the first console-style RPG, Dragon Quest II's overall design philosophy was the foundation upon which many RPGs after would build upon. You had complex party dynamics, much deeper strategy, a large map to explore, a form of transportation to enable that freedom, the game seeing a design shift after getting said vehicle, so on and so forth. Dragon Quest I may have been the first console RPG, but Dragon Quest II was the game that all RPGs after used as their foundation. However, the game is marred by a poorly paced and an imbalanced second half. While the concept of a maritime adventure was innovative at the time, the investigative qualities were novel, and each city did have personality, none of that can cover up how many flaws and questionable design choices exist in this portion of the game. Additionally, you have an endgame that borderlines on the ridiculous that contains the mother of all grinding sessions. Undoubtedly, Dragon Quest II is an important part of gaming history, but it's also a prime example of how a few flaws, when bad enough, can stain an entire game. Much like with Dragon Quest I, if you can manage to play the Super Famicom version, which fixes some of the game's issues, I would absolutely say that you should play it.